inviting Bibek Debroy to make the keynote speech. Bibek Debroy is an economist and was educated in Ramakrishna Mission School, Narendrapur Presidency College, Kolkata. And I know him as a prolific writer and who has not writing not only about books on economy, but around translations and many more stuff. Professionally, he is now currently the chair of the Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. Bibek, you want to make the remarks from here? Or where are you comfortable?
Namaste, and I'm deliberately saying namaste for a reason I will allude to later. Let me begin by thanking Nepal Economic Forum for having invited me here, for having hosted me here. In particular, I wish to thank Sujeev Shakya. Someone asked me, how did you meet Sujeev and how long have you known him? How long do you know him? I don't know the answer to either question, except that I have known Nepal Economic Forum and Sujeev for years and years. And this is not the first time I've come to a NEFmeet. Sujeev asked me to talk about India, to talk about what has happened in India at the time of COVID, to talk about India and what has been happening in India after COVID. So that's the broad terrain I'm going to cover in the 20 minutes odd that I have at my disposal. To me, before we even talk about COVID, we should quickly mention some of the initiatives the Narendra Modi government has introduced since May 2014. As all of you present here know, this is the second term of the Narendra Modi government, but when I say Narendra Modi government, I mean also the first term because there's a certain continuity in policies. Since May 2014, there were several initiatives. I'm not going to bother you with numbers and dashboards, but those initiatives involved a particular attention on the rural sector. They involved use of information technology. They involved the opening of bank accounts. They involved the encouragement of digital transactions. They involved the use of Aadhaar, which is a little bit of a piece of, which is actually a number, which functions now almost as a form of national identity. Also in the process, there was an identification using a decentralized survey of people who would be beneficiaries of subsidies. It's called the SECC. I think all of this had a bearing on what happened when COVID suddenly happened. COVID, as everyone knows, was an exogenous shock. Whenever there has been a plague, a pandemic, an epidemic of whatever form, it has always originated, ever since these started to be documented, through cross-border movements of labor. And this is precisely what happened in India too, with the first patient being detected in Kerala. It was an exogenous shock. It was a shock that very few countries knew how to grapple with. And if you cast your minds back to December 2019 or January 2020, And particularly as the first phase of COVID proceeded, till around March 2020, there was a dire prognosis for India. You had models emanating not only from Washington, but certainly from Washington, saying that 300 million people would be infected by COVID in India, 30 million people would die, and these were all very confident assertions. None of this has happened. Of course, there have been deaths. I have lost close friends and relatives, particularly during the second phase. But the numbers are nowhere near as alarming as the models suggested. Particularly if you normalize for population, the infection rates were lower than many other countries across the world, and the mortality rates were also lower. Yes, you will have read reports that the medical certification of cause of death is uncertain. It's not all that well organized in India, which is obviously true in any informal country, largely unorganized, self-employed. But there's a difference between deaths and cause of death. Yes, there is underreporting of deaths also, but because the registration of deaths has also shot up, it is very difficult not to count deaths. The certification of deaths is a different problem, and it's certainly possible that there are some deaths which have been caused by COVID which were attributed to something else. But the fact of the matter remains, infection rates were low, death rates were low, and initially there was again a dire prognosis. India will never be able to vaccinate the entire population. India will never be able to deliver a vaccine that is indigenously produced. Post facto, all of that has been proved wrong. Today, if I am asked for a vaccination certificate, I don't have a physical vaccination certificate. When the need arises, if I travel to the West, I have to print one. Everywhere in India, vaccination certificate is accepted in the form of something that's on this mobile phone. And I look at the vaccination certificates that are given in some of the so-called developed countries, and one can only call them digitally less developed countries. I recently went to visit one particular monument in Delhi, very recently. When I turned up there was an admission fee of 15 rupees. And the instructions throughout the country are, you cannot pay in cash. So I had my credit card. I offered to pay by credit card. The guard said, no, our credit card reading machine is not working. So I wondered, what was I going to do now? My driver said, no issues. Main Paytm kar dunga. So here is a driver, and my driver is no exception. He paid that money through Paytm. Obviously, COVID has taken a toll, as it has in everywhere in the world. Effectively, every country in the world has lost 2 years of its development trajectory. So if at one point in time in India we talked about attaining a $5 trillion GDP target, it's been pushed back by 2 years at least. If one spoke about attaining the SDG goals By 2030, that too has been pushed back by 2 years. So 1 year wiped out because of COVID, 1 year recovering what happened as a result of COVID. And when one is talking about COVID, there is the health cost, not only mortality, there is the morbidity also, long COVID, so to speak. There is a loss in terms of human development outcomes of children who have lost 2 years in the learning cycle. And there are also economic costs caused by the inevitable lockdown. You must, of course, appreciate that India is a decentralized country. Governance is decentralized. There is the union government, there are the state governments, and there is local government. And there is a 7th schedule to the Constitution which sets out which government is supposed to do what. And for something like epidemic diseases, when COVID happened, the relevant piece of legislation was the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897, reflecting the colonial legacy, which meant the union government had no powers to do anything except at the border, because health was completely a state subject. Now let me leave that aside. When COVID happened, post-COVID, the general suggestion on the part of a lot of economists was, if this is not a case for public expenditure, then what is? There has been a lockdown, economic activity has suffered, so there must be a stimulus. There must be a significant economic stimulus. A significant economic stimulus primarily through tax deductions. Since May 2014, this government has been very careful about fiscal rectitude and fiscal consolidation. So despite advice to the contrary, there was no profligate expenditure except very marginal stuff on food subsidies. By the way, COVID also triggered a portability in welfare benefits wherever you may happen to be. Part of the initial problem was, I mentioned, identity. Part of the initial problem was for urban migrants, there was no identity. So it was difficult to get a tab on an urban migrant. It's only now started to happen. So given what I said about fiscal rectitude, the expenditure that subsequently happened was in the form of capital expenditure primarily, except what I said about food, and to a lesser extent about fertilizer. I'm talking about the union government. What is the prognosis, not only domestically on the part of the government, externally on the part of other external advisors also? The prognosis is that this year and next year, the real rate of growth will be between 7 and 7.5%. Given the poverty levels, given the levels of unemployment, obviously the rate of growth needs to be higher. The aspirational rate of growth needs to be 8%, 8.5%, perhaps even 9%. 9%, of course, is going to be difficult because the external environment is not very benign now. Not only is there protectionism, not only is the WTO in a limbo, there are also geopolitical tensions, of which Russia-Ukraine is only one. In terms of drivers of growth, there are just 4 in terms of the national income identity: consumption, investment expenditure, government expenditure, and net exports. Since net exports, given what I said about global uncertainty, are not likely to be a major driver, this leaves consumption, investments, and government expenditure. Government expenditure, I already mentioned, is constrained by that objective of fiscal rectitude, so it has to be perforce concentrated in capital expenditure. So far as investments and consumption expenditure are concerned, without muddying waters too much, when there is uncertainty, discretionary consumption expenditure tends to be postponed. When there is uncertainty, investment expenditure that can be postponed is postponed. And of course, there is uncertainty globally. But so far as uncertainty domestically is concerned, given the continuity of policies, it's sort of easing away. And therefore, there are indicators that both consumption expenditure and investment expenditure, they are recovering. Investments are picking up. Obviously, India is a very large country. It's a heterogeneous country. So investments, domestic and foreign, don't happen in Delhi. They happen in the states. And there is a great deal of heterogeneity amongst the states. What is the bottom line of what I have said? The bottom line of what I have said is, though an aspirational rate of growth might have been 9%, I said this year, next year, we will get 7 to 7.5%. I think the medium-term trajectory for India is also of the order of 7% or thereabouts. A rate of growth of 7% changes the economy, changes the society. You can see what has happened to Nepal in terms of reductions in poverty, in terms of improvement in socio-economic conditions. If you cast your minds back to the famous Goldman Sachs report, Dreaming with the BRICS, the real rate of growth was just about 5.5%. You got those enormous numbers because of the exponential nature of growth. India is now celebrating the 75th year of independence. In India, we call it Amrit Kal, which is going to set the template for India in the next 25 years, leading up to 2047. Whatever conservative projection you might have, and that's a function not just of real rate of growth, also inflation and the exchange rate, you will get figures like, in today's dollars, in 2047, India will have a per capita income of about 10,000 US dollars and a gross size of GDP, aggregate GDP, of just about 20 trillion US dollars. This is not an overly optimistic figure. These are conservative projections. India and Indian society will change. I said namaste at the beginning. There is a reason I said namaste. Namaste is so much better than hello because it conveys a nuance of I bow down before you, namaste. More importantly, people who build these models have been puzzled about why India did not suffer much more under COVID. Oh, different variant. Oh, natural immunity. Oh, numbers are misreported. I happen to think a lot has to do with our traditional values, which characterize not just India, but Nepal also. I don't immediately shake hands and spread the infection. I do namaste. I wash my hands before eating. I don't use infected cutlery. I take off my shoes before I enter the house. All of these traditional values, I think, have ensured that we have handled COVID much better than many countries in the world. Thank you very much.